In this course, I will share my secrets for building a successful Patreon to fund your creative passion. While my perspective is that of a digital artist, much of the information in this course can be useful to just about any type of creator. Rather than just regurgitate Patreon's generalized best practices, I'm going to share what has and has not worked for me as a full-time content creator. I have been on Patreon for over 9 years, and I have made over $125,000. This is in addition to a significant portion of the $300,000 I've made from additional sales of products purchased by my patrons. Whether you are new to Patreon or you already have some patrons, this course is full of advice, best practices, pitfalls, and personal experience, all of which can benefit you as a creator. I believe strongly in the creator economy, and I want to help you find success in it like I have. I want to make it clear that my approach to building and running my Patreon is not the only way to do it. You should use your own judgment to decide what works best for you, as my opinion is just that, an opinion. I am not a certified expert on managing memberships, I am not your guru or consultant, and I'm not directing you to make any of these changes. I'm simply sharing my experiences. It's up to you to decide whether or not to take anything from what I have said, and you do so at your own risk. I do not take responsibility for the performance of your Patreon. Let's dive into the course by starting with an overview of Patreon and how you can benefit from it as a creator. Patreon is a membership platform that allows your fans or patrons to support your work directly, while also giving you the opportunity to build a deeper relationship with them by providing resources that would not otherwise be possible. This could include behind-the-scenes previews of your work, digital or physical goods that you have created, exclusive tutorials, or just about anything. My journey with Patreon starts with YouTube. My primary YouTube channel helps artists enjoy digital art and learn some new skills along the way. I started posting free digital art tutorials to YouTube on a regular basis in the summer of 2013. By 2015, my channel had grown enough to where I knew content creation was something that I could do to make a living. I had also begun to use Patreon around that time and had some initial success with it, which led me to change the way that I thought about content creation. Suddenly, YouTube ad revenue was not the only way to earn money from what I had been creating. Around that same time, I had also begun producing video courses that I sold to my students. Patreon made it easy to drive traffic to my courses with a patrons-only discount. Between 2016 and 2019, I experimented with various growth strategies for my Patreon. I gradually refined my offerings and the way I deliver benefits. In 2021, I began using YouTube memberships and then Gumroad subscriptions, both of which are Patreon competitors. This resulted in me losing some patrons, which moved to a different platform. Currently, I have around 80 patrons, but there are another 100 on the other platforms. The pandemic really shook things up for everyone, especially creators on Patreon. At first, while everyone was stuck at home, my revenue sharply increased. I am one of the fortunate creators who still had a lot of support, but many creators saw their membership revenue pretty much disappear. However, steadily over the course of 2022 through 2023, my patrons have been slowly dropping off due to financial constraints. Still, overall, I have a lot of support, and it's encouraging to know that what I do is valued so much. That's where you want to be as a content creator. You need to provide value beyond something disposable. It's not just the brushes and other digital goods I offer that keeps people subscribing. It's because I am a resource for knowledge, I have expertise in my field, I have a solid reputation, and I have developed a bond with my patrons over nearly a decade. I am always on the cutting edge in terms of developments in digital art hardware and software, and I'm always exploring new ways to enjoy digital art. This gives current patrons something to look forward to and encourages new patrons to get involved. Enough about me. Let's go over some of the benefits and downsides of starting a Patreon so you know what you're getting into. There are many benefits to setting up a Patreon. Patreon has enabled me to invest more time and money into growing my business. The additional income I earn allows me to gradually improve the quality of my productions. Another benefit is that I'm able to boost my other revenue streams by encouraging patrons to buy my paid courses at a discount. Through patron feedback and polls, I am able to gain valuable insight into how I can optimize the content and products I offer. In a way, Patreon forces me to be creative every month. And it allows me to create niche content that best serves my core fans instead of generalized content for the masses. And last, it motivates me to be an artist when I see how many people benefit enough from my work to support me. It reinforces my purpose and gives me confidence. For every light, there is a shadow. I would be doing you a disservice if I led you to believe everything about being a content creator is good. So let's talk about the downsides to starting a Patreon. First, you may invest a considerable amount of time and effort into creating content for Patreon, but never see any returns. This is the reality for a lot of creators. Second, if you do become successful, you might quickly become overwhelmed and burned out. Patreon is a long-term commitment which can easily conflict with a busy schedule or other responsibilities. Third, some patrons may view you more as a product than an artist they want to support. Their sense of self-entitlement can be difficult to cope with. And finally, it can be frustrating to try to please everyone. Some patrons may be impossible to satisfy, which may make you question why you even set up a Patreon to begin with. If that sounds intimidating, it is. I have struggled a lot over the years, and I am always working to fit Patreon into my life. But that's just par for the course if you want content creation to be your career. If you're still ready to try out Patreon, let's move on to the next step. Before we get into building anything, it would be best to prepare a bit. There are a few questions you'll need to answer up front so that you can choose the right direction and not waste a lot of time. First, do you have an audience? I have been successful on Patreon primarily because I have an audience on YouTube that I can promote my benefits to. It's going to be a lot harder for you to accumulate a substantial number of members if a large number of people aren't already consuming your content. If you're lucky, 1 to 3% of your audience might become members. In my case, less than 1% of my 200,000 subscribers are current patrons. If you have at least 10,000 subscribers, the best case scenario is that you make $1,000 to $3,000 a month. The worst case scenario is that you make $0 a month, but it'll likely be somewhere in between those two extremes. If you only end up making $100 to $500 a month, is that going to be worth your time to maintain? If Patreon is only side income and isn't too demanding, then any amount of money is good. But if you're trying to make Patreon your full-time job, that's probably not enough to live on. If you don't have any audience, this course will not be as valuable to you since you won't be able to go beyond setting up your Patreon. It would be better to build brand recognition first, and then once you have an audience, Patreon would be worth trying. I'd suggest starting a social media presence, such as a YouTube channel. There are numerous ideas for content you can explore, so I won't get into that here, but at the very least, you can show the process of how you create your work. If you're in the videos, that's even better because then people can connect with you and may want to support what you do. That would be the most effective in my opinion. I have an entire YouTube channel called Creators First that is dedicated to helping content creators build an audience, so check that out if you want to learn more. The next question you need to answer is, are you prepared to honor your commitments long term? Patreon is a monthly commitment that can be difficult to end. Do you have the time for that, or do you have a job, family, or other responsibilities that preclude your ability to post consistently? Life can be unexpected and stuff happens. Some flexibility is acceptable and most patrons will understand if you need to make an exception here or there. But if you're flaky every month, you probably aren't going to be able to retain members. There are ways to reduce your burden each month and schedule content ahead of time, but we will come back to that later in this course. Next, can you describe your Patreon? By that I mean, can you succinctly explain what the purpose of your Patreon is and what the benefit is to someone who might want to join? If not, and you just know that you want to earn money, that's not good enough. Go back to the drawing board and spend some time planning. The purpose of my Patreon is to provide digital art resources that would otherwise not exist, and the revenue I generate gives me the ability to improve the quality of my content and make it more sustainable. I could certainly word that differently and elaborate more on what that means, but that at least gives you an idea of what my Patreon is about. I've seen too many of my peers set up a Patreon and pretty much just say, I make art, so give me money if you feel like it. Needless to say, those artists aren't making anything. You need to clearly communicate the value offered to your patrons. If there isn't any value being offered, then don't expect to get anything in return. Sure, there will be patrons who give you money and don't ever take advantage of your benefits, but those are rare. Most people expect something in return for their money. It doesn't have to be an equal exchange of value, but you need to give something to get something, even if it's just a little bit of effort. I offer brushes, courses, product discounts, digital downloads, behind-the-scenes content, reference images, early releases, and much more. It's not difficult for someone who is into digital art to be enticed by that, and it gives them incentive to stick around for a while. Here's another important question. Are you prepared to promote your Patreon? It's not enough to just set up a Patreon and start producing benefits. You need to regularly promote your Patreon to grow your audience over time. You'll also need to replace lost patrons with new ones, or you will end up back at zero. If you have a successful social media presence, then adding Patreon to your current promotional schedule is a good start. Next, it would be good to think about whether you are trying to make full-time or part-time income from Patreon. If it's the latter, then you've got your work cut out for you. I view Patreon as only side money. It would be a lot of work to generate 100% of my income from Patreon. I'm not certain it would even be possible. It's much more efficient and profitable for me to put most of my effort into course sales and my other income streams. That's not to mention that if Patreon went under, or I simply lost all of my patrons, I wouldn't have any income if I were entirely dependent on that one source. Sure, there are some Patreon creators who make tens of thousands of dollars each month, but those are usually celebrities or very well-established teams of creators. You probably aren't either of those. I wouldn't aspire to be a full-time Patreon creator, but if that's your goal, go for it. I believe it's safer to diversify your income if you want to be responsible. As I mentioned earlier, the pandemic wiped out a lot of creators on Patreon. I have course sales, ad revenue from YouTube, affiliate links, sponsored content, and other revenue sources, which is how I have weathered the storm. Success happens over years, even decades, so there's no avoiding catastrophe. You can only adapt to it or mitigate the effects of it. Also important is whether or not you are prepared to run a business. After all, the income you generate from Patreon is taxable, and you will need to claim it at the end of the year. There are other business-like aspects of running a Patreon, such as customer service, and perhaps more depending on what you're offering. Speaking of that, now we need to get into the details of what you're going to offer to your patrons. There's no sense in setting up a page and pricing tiers that revolve around benefits if you don't have any. This can be a work in progress, and you can introduce new benefits over time or remove benefits if they no longer work for you or your patrons. When I started my Patreon, I was already offering downloadable content for free. All I had to do was paywall it. If you already have a social media or other following, then you probably have been giving away valuable content for free in one way or another. It would be good to identify how much of that content is advanced or requires a lot of effort, and consider whether it makes more sense to offer that to patrons for a subscription fee. In my case, I was giving away custom digital art brushes for Corel Painter and advertising it on my YouTube channel. Most of my audience does not use Corel Painter and could care less about it, so when I stopped offering free brushes, it didn't have a noticeable impact on my channel. The benefit to charging a subscription fee for my brushes is that now I had a source of income that gave me more time and resources to create those brushes and eventually other types of content. Many of the people who were getting the brushes for free wanted to see me be more successful at that so they could get access to more of my content. So offering memberships to your audience isn't necessarily going to be a hard sell. Yes, you are paywalling content that was once free, but you're also making it better with the help of people who appreciate it the most. There will be a couple of very vocal people who will express their distaste for your decision, but ultimately anyone who cares about you will want to see you succeed. Anyone who feels self-entitled and thinks you owe it to them to work for free isn't a true fan. I would ignore those folks and focus on catering to the fans that want to support you. Eventually, you will have two different audiences, and the non-patrons will come to realize that they are reaping the benefits too when fans support your content. It's important to stress that I didn't stop offering free content on YouTube. Free content is essential to generating new patrons. I just don't offer niche content or very time-consuming content for free anymore. I also want to emphasize that not everything you create is a good candidate for membership benefits. I have tried offering video courses for free to patrons instead of selling them separately, but then I only made a tiny fraction of what I could have made selling those courses separately. This was a mistake because it didn't increase my number of patrons much, and the level of work each month quickly became more than I could handle. There's also the consideration that something really valuable like a long format course could be pirated. It's less likely that someone who paid full price for your course would pirate it versus someone who can get it for just a few dollars. Just keep in mind that anything you offer could be exploited by someone to generate revenue for themselves. Or someone could simply redistribute it for free. I've not experienced this myself, but I'm sure it happens. I will also mention that it's your content and you can do what you want with it. You can offer the same content to patrons as you do to paying customers on other websites. For example, I offer my brushes to my patrons, but I also sell those brushes on Gumroad to customers who don't want a monthly subscription. Most people will choose the less expensive membership option, but some choose to buy the brushes for full price instead. I would perform an in-depth analysis of what you create and try to select benefits that are not difficult to fulfill each month and won't take away from generating new patrons or dilute your potential to generate revenue with other methods. Here's some ideas for benefits I offer as an artist. Exclusive high-resolution or layered artwork, product discounts and free products, brushes and custom content, sneak peeks, behind the scenes, and bonus videos, long format or real-time videos of my art process, exclusive tutorials, group activities, and priority access to me through comments or private messages. As I mentioned, there are some benefits I wouldn't recommend. I don't offer anything too time-consuming that I can't consistently deliver, like monthly courses, for example. I also tried offering one-on-one lessons, but that turned out to be a pain because sometimes patrons would miss appointments and I'd have to owe them a backlog of lessons. Anything that is a job on its own is probably not a good benefit. Just as well, anything that has a cost involved with its production will be very challenging. For example, mailing prints to your patrons. Sure, that's not difficult if you have 10 patrons, but what if you suddenly have 1,000? How are you going to scale that up? How are you going to balance making art with ordering and shipping prints 1,000 times each month? How will you deal with returned packages or patrons who never got theirs? One of the biggest mistakes you can make is turning Patreon into a job, and I put that in air quotes. A job is a responsibility. Patreon has job-like elements to it, but it should be closer to passive income. None of what I offer is difficult to fulfill each month. In fact, I can create a lot of it ahead of time and simply release it a little at a time throughout the year. A good analogy for my membership model would be Netflix meets Costco. I have a large library of content you can learn from and use at any time as long as you are a member. And while you are a member, you can get a deep discount on my other products. I add new content to that library each month, and I create new paid courses several times each year, so there is always something to look forward to. The new stuff I create each month is very low effort, and that library of content is always there so that when people join, they feel like they're getting a lot of value up front. The new content I produce each month is essential because a new patron might get the impression that I am inactive if I don't post something fresh while they are subscribed. You're probably wondering, what about people who sign up for a month, download everything, and then unsubscribe? That's always a possibility. If you like, you can offer content for a month, then remove it. That's more work on your end to remove it, but it's your prerogative. I prefer to set it and forget it. Again, I'm trying to treat Patreon like passive income, so the less involved I am, the easier it is for me to manage. The way I view the purpose of my Patreon is fine for me, but you should do things however it feels right to you as long as it works. The final question to consider is, what are your long-term goals? What do you hope to accomplish by having a successful Patreon? This vision is important because it helps encourage patrons to get involved and stay involved. Your goals should be with your patrons in mind so they feel like if they stick around long term, it will pay off. My earliest goal was simple. I wanted to improve the quality of my content by purchasing better cameras, lighting, microphones, and other gear. That extra money I earned each month from my patrons gave me a budget to invest, and sure enough, here I am with a more professional setup. It's easy to see how much better my production quality has become if you go back to before 2015 and watch some of my older videos. And everyone, whether they have been my patron or not, has benefited from this. Had I never been successful on Patreon, there would be so many resources that just wouldn't exist. My oldest patrons are aware of that, which is why they've continued pledging their support each month for years. I have other goals, some of which I have abandoned for being impractical or too grandiose, like going on a world tour, but I think that gives you an idea of what we're going for here. Envisioning the future not only encourages your patrons, it also helps you grow as an artist by allowing you to work towards something greater. If you are not growing as a creator, your Patreon may not grow either. If you were able to answer all of the key questions and you're prepared to build a Patreon, follow me to the next step.